The sun had begun to dip behind the towering skyscrapers of New York, casting long shadows across the city streets. It was a typical spring evening, warm but not too hot, as Richard Matthews sat on the porch of his upscale brownstone home, sipping a glass of bourbon. His thoughts were on his son, Alex, who had recently become engaged to a woman named Sarah Winters. They had met just a year ago, and now Alex was eagerly preparing for their wedding. As a proud father, Richard had watched his son grow into a fine young man, a rising star in the world of business. However, as he sat there in the quiet of his home, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the past few weeks, he had noticed strange behavior from Sarah. Her interactions with him had become distant, almost cold. She had refused to come over for dinner on several occasions, citing work as an excuse. Richard, a man who prided himself on his sharp instincts, had begun to feel that there was more to Sarah than met the eye. Alex, on the other hand, seemed entirely smitten with her, almost blind to the subtle red flags. Richard had tried to voice his concerns, but his son dismissed them, brushing off his father's worries with a simple, "Dad, you're overthinking it." But tonight, everything was about to change. It was a typical family dinner gathering when the truth finally came to light. The table was set, and the house was filled with laughter. Sarah had arrived early, as always, to help prepare the meal, and Richard couldn't help but notice the slight nervousness in her posture. Alex, busy with his phone, didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. "Sarah, are you all right?" Richard asked, his voice laced with concern. She froze for a moment, her hand lingering on the bowl of mashed potatoes she had been serving. "Yes, of course," she replied, but there was a subtle tremble in her voice. "I'm just a little tired." Richard didn't press the matter further, though something in his gut told him it wasn't just fatigue that was bothering her. As the evening wore on, Richard's curiosity turned into something else: suspicion. Sarah seemed more distracted than usual, her laughter less genuine. The warm ambiance of the dinner felt suddenly stifling. Richard's instincts told him that something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He decided to leave the table for a moment and stepped into the living room. That was when he saw it. On the coffee table, Sarah's purse was lying open, a few papers spilling out. Richard was about to ignore it when a piece of paper caught his eye. It was a letter, folded neatly in half. He glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, before he grabbed the letter and unfolded it. The words inside made his blood run cold. The letter was a medical one, addressed to a doctor. Stephen Wells, a prominent gender specialist. It confirmed that Sarah Winters, the woman his son intended to marry, had undergone a series of gender reassignment surgeries and was, in fact, a man. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what he had just read. His mind raced with questions. How could Alex not know? How had Sarah managed to keep the secret for so long? And why hadn't she told him the truth? Suddenly, he was no longer able to breathe properly. His vision blurred. He could hear the laughter from the dining room, but it felt distant, like it was happening in another world. For the first time in years, Richard felt completely out of control. His mind was clouded with a single thought: this cannot be happening. Richard stormed back into the dining room, the letter clenched in his fist. He had to confront her. But as he opened his mouth to speak, Alex looked up at him with an expression of confusion and concern. "Dad, what's wrong?" Richard's eyes flared with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You need to explain this to me," he demanded, holding up the letter. The room fell silent. Sarah stood up abruptly, her face draining of color as she realized that the secret she had worked so hard to hide was now out in the open. Alex stood up as well, his face contorted in confusion. "Dad, what is that? Explain it to me," Richard shouted, his voice trembling with fury. "How long were you planning to keep this from me, Sarah? How long were you going to let my son marry a lie?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she seemed at a loss for words. Alex stood frozen, staring at the letter in his father's hand. I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Sarah whispered. "I love Alex. I didn't want to lose him." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. The room felt like it was closing in on him. He could barely hear Alex's voice as it broke through the silence. "Sarah, is this true? Are you really a man?" Alex's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. The words hit Richard like a blow. Alex was devastated, his face a mask of shock and hurt. Richard watched as his son's world crumbled around him. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulation. It was all too much. Richard could feel his anger building up inside him, turning into something dark and dangerous. He had always prided himself on being calm and collected, but in this moment, he felt a deep, overwhelming rage that he had never known before. Alex didn't say anything more, his expression frozen in disbelief. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to shrink under Richard's gaze. She was no longer the woman he had thought she was. He had been blind, but now everything made sense. The coldness, the distance, the secrecy, it had all been part of the lie. Richard could feel the tension in the air as he stood there, his hands trembling. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in years, Richard found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. The truth had shattered his perception of the world, and he knew he could never go back to the way things were. In that moment, Richard knew that his life and his son's life would never be the same again. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the tension hanging thick in the air like a storm that wouldn't pass. Richard Matthews could feel his heart racing, his mind a blur of conflicting thoughts. He had never imagined that his life would come to this, that his own son's fiancée would be hiding such a dangerous secret. And yet, there she was, standing across from him, tears streaming down her face, her eyes pleading for understanding that Richard wasn't willing to give. Alex stood frozen, his body stiff with disbelief. The shock was written all over his face, the color draining from his skin as he processed the weight of the revelation. His gaze kept flickering between Sarah and his father, his eyes filled with hurt and confusion. "How could you lie to me like this?" Alex finally managed to whisper, his voice hoarse with emotion. "How long, Sarah? How long have you known?" Sarah stepped back, shaking her head as though the truth was something she had never planned to reveal, something she had never thought would come out. "Alex, I never meant for you to find out like this," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of guilt and desperation. "I wanted to tell you, I really did, but I was so afraid. I knew you wouldn't accept me." Richard's anger flared, his face red with fury. "You didn't just lie to Alex, Sarah. You lied to me too. And you lied to our entire family for months. You've been deceiving everyone. How could you live with yourself?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she looked at Richard, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I love Alex. I really do. Love." Richard spat. "You call that love? You've been living in a fantasy, playing with people's emotions. You didn't even have the decency to tell the truth before you got engaged to my son." The words stung, and Sarah's shoulders slumped. She was barely holding herself together, as if the weight of the deception she had carried for so long was finally crashing down on her. Alex was still staring at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pain. "Alex, I'm so sorry," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. I wanted to be the woman you needed, the woman you deserved." Alex stood there for a moment, as though frozen in place, his face pale and contorted with emotion. Finally, he stepped back, his hand gripping the back of the chair, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "I don't know what to say to you right now," Alex whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Richard could see his son's world unraveling, piece by piece. He wanted to comfort Alex, to tell him that everything would be okay, but how could he? How could he offer any kind of reassurance when his own trust had been so utterly shattered? "Please," Sarah said, stepping toward Alex. "I never wanted to deceive you. I never wanted to be a man. But this is who I am. I can't change that." Alex looked up at her then, his eyes filled with so much pain that Richard felt his own heart ache. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why didn't you trust me enough to be honest?" Tears streaked down Sarah's face. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid of how you'd react. But I love you, Alex. I love you more than anything." Richard could feel the coldness creeping into his chest. He had spent his life working to build a future for his family, to create a life of security and respect. And now everything he had known seemed like a lie. His son's future, his family's future. It had all been built on a foundation of deception. "Alex," Richard said, his voice rough, "you need to make a choice here. You can't live in this fantasy. You need to wake up and face the truth. This woman—" He paused, his mind racing as he tried to find the right words. "She's not who you think she is." Alex looked at him, his eyes glazed with shock. "Dad, please just stop. I need some time to think. I need some space." The words felt like a dagger to Richard's heart. He had never imagined his son would turn to him for comfort, only to push him away in such a way. Richard knew that Alex needed time to process everything, but in that moment, all he could feel was the overwhelming weight of betrayal. "Take all the time you need," Richard replied, his voice strained. "But don't let her lie to you any longer." Alex didn't say anything more. He turned and walked away, disappearing down the hallway to his room, leaving Richard and Sarah standing alone in the dining room. The silence was suffocating, and Richard could barely breathe. For a moment, Sarah didn't say anything either. She just stood there, her face pale and her hands trembling. Then she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this to happen," she said. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I wanted to live a normal life with Alex. I wanted to be his partner, his wife." Richard shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. "You've done enough, Sarah. It's over. I don't want you near my family again. You've broken my son's heart." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she didn't speak. She knew deep down that there was no coming back from this. The damage was done. The lies had been exposed. And now there was nothing left but the aftermath of a shattered future. Without another word, Sarah turned and left the house, walking out into the night with nothing but the weight of her actions following her every step. Richard stood there watching her go, feeling a cold emptiness settle in the pit of his stomach. As the door closed behind Sarah, Richard felt the loss of something irreparable. He had spent his life building a family, a future, only for it to be torn apart in a single moment of truth. His mind raced with thoughts of vengeance, of how he would make sure Sarah paid for what she had done. But more than anything, he was consumed by a singular, terrible thought. What would become of Alex now? The days that followed the revelation felt like a blur for Richard Matthews. He found himself pacing around his brownstone home, unable to focus on anything. His thoughts were consumed by the same questions, spinning in endless circles. How had this happened? Why had Sarah lied for so long? And, most painfully, why had his son not seen the truth sooner? Alex had locked himself in his room for the better part of the next 2 days, hardly speaking, rarely leaving. Richard tried calling him a few times, but each attempt was met with silence. He couldn't blame his son for retreating into himself. This was a betrayal that no one could easily recover from. But it left Richard feeling powerless and desperate, watching his family crumble before him. Sarah's departure had been swift and final. She'd left the house early that morning, taking only a few personal belongings, and never came back. Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph when she walked out the door, the finality of it giving him a momentary sense of relief. Yet it wasn't long before that relief was replaced with a more profound emptiness. The house, once full of the promise of weddings and new beginnings, felt like a hollow shell. The silence in the air was thick, oppressive. Richard had always considered himself a man of reason, someone who made decisions based on logic. But in the wake of everything, something in him had changed. He had always been a protector of his family, but now he felt as though he had failed. His son had been deceived for months by someone who had claimed to love him, and now Alex's future was in ruins. Richard had done everything for his family, but he hadn't seen this coming, and it filled him with a dark, gnawing anger. That night, Richard found himself standing in the kitchen, staring out of the window into the darkened streets of New York. His mind was racing, as it had been for days, but now a new thought had taken hold of him. Something darker, something that he wasn't sure he could suppress. He wasn't just angry at Sarah anymore. He was angry at the world. He was angry at himself for not noticing the signs, for not protecting Alex from the deceit that had torn his life apart. The realization hit him like a slap in the face. His son had been a victim, yes, but so had he. Sarah had lied to both of them. She had manipulated and betrayed them both in the worst way possible. But now Richard had a choice. He could continue down the path of righteous anger, or he could take control of the situation in the way he knew best, by solving the problem. It wasn't until the following evening that Richard decided to act on his thoughts. Alex had finally come down from his room, but he barely spoke. He was a shell of the person he had been before Sarah entered his life. Richard could see it in his eyes. The hurt, the confusion, the betrayal. Alex had been left with nothing but the wreckage of his own emotions. "Son, we need to talk," Richard said as Alex sat down at the dining room table, his face unreadable. Alex didn't meet his father's gaze. "About what?" "About Sarah." Alex stiffened, his shoulders tense. "I don't want to talk about her," he muttered. "I understand that," Richard replied, keeping his voice calm. "But you need to hear this, Alex. You need to understand what happened." Alex didn't say anything. He simply stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists. Richard sat across from him, watching his son, seeing the pain etched in his face. He had always thought of Alex as a strong young man, but now, in the face of this betrayal, he seemed so fragile, so lost. "Son, what Sarah did to you, it was wrong. It was a lie. And I want you to know that I will make sure she never comes near you again. I will protect you. Always." Alex finally looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "How could I not see it, Dad? How could I have been so blind? She fooled me. She fooled all of us." Richard's heart broke at the sound of his son's voice. "You were in love, Alex, and she took advantage of that. But it's not your fault. You have to understand that." Alex wiped his eyes and nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. Richard knew that it would take time for Alex to come to terms with everything. The betrayal would sting for a long time, maybe even forever. But that didn't change the fact that Richard had to do something about it. He had to make sure Sarah never returned to their lives, never caused any more pain. The next day, Richard did something that made him uneasy. He reached out to an old friend of his, Detective Thomas Carter, a seasoned investigator with the NYPD. Thomas had known Richard for years, and the two had worked together on several business-related matters. Richard had always respected Thomas's ability to uncover the truth, no matter how deep the secrets were buried. "Tom, I need your help," Richard said over the phone, his voice tight. "It's about Sarah Winters." There was a long pause on the other end. "What's going on, Richard? It's complicated. She's not who she says she is. I need you to look into her past. Find out everything you can." Tom's voice dropped lower. "You sure you want to do this? You know what you're asking, right? This is going to get messy." "I know," Richard replied, his voice cold. "But I have to know the truth. I need to make sure she never comes near my family again." "All right," Tom said after a pause. "I'll see what I can do. I'll start digging." Richard hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. He knew that once Tom started investigating, nothing would remain hidden. But at that moment, he didn't care. He wanted the truth, no matter what it cost. Later that evening, as Richard sat alone in his study, his mind churned with thoughts of what would come next. He knew that Sarah would do anything to keep her secret buried. She had already proven that by deceiving Alex for so long. But Richard was determined to expose her, to tear apart the false persona she had so carefully constructed. As the hours passed, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the investigation into Sarah's past would lead him to something even darker. There were pieces of the puzzle he hadn't seen yet, pieces that would reveal the true extent of the lies Sarah had woven. But as Richard sat there, waiting for the truth to come to light, he couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled in his gut. There was something more at play here, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined, and he wasn't prepared for the horrors that would soon be uncovered. The morning after Richard made the call to Detective Thomas Carter, the weight of what was unfolding began to sink deeper into his bones. He couldn't shake the growing sense of urgency gnawing at him. Alex, though outwardly calm, was still reeling from the shock. It was clear that the young man had withdrawn completely into himself. Richard had tried to talk to him a few times that morning, but Alex simply shut down each time, retreating into his silence. Richard, meanwhile, was busy with something else, waiting. Waiting for the first signs of the investigation to bear fruit. By the time the sun had begun to set, Richard had almost forgotten about the call he made to Detective Carter. But his phone's sudden buzz snapped him back to reality. It was a text from Carter. "We have a problem. Meet me at the office in an hour." Richard's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. He didn't respond immediately, but instead found himself pacing the house. What was Carter implying? What had he uncovered so quickly? An hour later, Richard arrived at the NYPD's downtown precinct, where he was led into a small office. Detective Carter was already sitting behind his desk, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as Richard entered and gestured for him to sit. "Thanks for coming in so quickly," Carter said, his tone unusually serious. "What's going on, Tom?" Richard asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "What did you find?" Carter leaned back in his chair and set his coffee cup down. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, and for the first time, Richard noticed a flicker of unease in the detective's usually composed demeanor. "Let me start by saying that Sarah Winters has a history," Carter began, folding his arms, "but not the kind of history you'd expect." Richard's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Carter slid a folder across the desk. It was thick, heavy with papers, and Richard could feel a chill creep up his spine as he opened it. Inside, there were copies of old documents, newspaper clippings, and what looked like police reports. At the top of the first page was Sarah's full name, but the details underneath were not what Richard had expected. The first document was a police report, dated 5 years ago, listing Sarah Winters under a different name, Samuel James Winters. Richard blinked and read the name again, his mind struggling to make sense of it. "Sarah's real name is Samuel?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Not just that," Carter replied, leaning forward. "Sarah, or Samuel, was involved in a very different life before the transition. She was arrested twice for assault charges, but the reports are vague. The most unsettling part is that there's a gap in the records. After that, the trail goes cold for a while." Richard felt his stomach twist. Assault charges. His mind reeled as he absorbed the information. Could this really be the same woman? Carter pulled out another document and placed it in front of Richard. It was a medical record listing a series of procedures done over the years, beginning with hormone treatments and culminating in gender reassignment surgery. But the more Richard looked, the more disturbed he became. The dates on the paperwork were inconsistent, and several sections of the records were redacted. There was also a reference to a psychiatric evaluation, but it was heavily censored. "The records are incomplete," Carter continued, his voice heavy with concern. "And what bothers me the most is that Sarah's, or Samuel's, transition wasn't just a personal one. It's likely that the person behind the name Sarah Winters has been using multiple identities for years." Richard felt the room close in around him. He reached for the papers and studied the name Samuel Winters over and over again. It was becoming clear to him now that Sarah's deception went far deeper than he had ever imagined. She wasn't just hiding her past. She had been carefully constructing a false identity, weaving a story that was carefully crafted to conceal the truth from everyone around her, including Alex. "I don't understand," Richard said, his voice thick with disbelief. "How could she have gotten this far without anyone noticing?" Carter took a deep breath. "It's not just the name change. From what I've gathered, there's a history of manipulation. She's moved around quite a bit, using different aliases and avoiding detection. But the most disturbing thing I found is that she's been tied to a string of other individuals who also underwent transitions, all of them in situations that ended badly." Richard's mind raced. His gut told him that something more sinister was unfolding. He wanted to ask more questions, but Carter was already moving forward, flipping through more documents in the folder. "Take a look at this," Carter said, pointing to a new set of documents. It was a series of police reports from a city several states away. A few years ago, there were reports of someone matching Sarah's description being involved in a violent altercation with a couple. The details are sparse, but witnesses say that the person was seen leaving the scene with blood on their hands. They never caught her, but the connection is troubling. Richard's eyes widened. He stared at the report in disbelief. Sarah was violent? Was she capable of something like that? "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but we need to consider the possibility that Sarah might have a violent streak," Carter said, watching Richard carefully. "What I'm trying to say is that this isn't just a case of a woman hiding her past. She's been hiding something much darker. And the question we need to answer is, why? The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. Richard felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, and suddenly the world seemed very dangerous. What had he been protecting all this time? This is too much, Richard muttered, running a hand through his hair. How could she have done this to Alex? To me? All of it. It's a lie. Carter looked grim. I don't know, Richard, but I can tell you this. There's a lot more going on here than just a simple deception. The deeper we dig, the darker it gets. We haven't even touched on the motive yet. Richard clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He could feel his anger rising, but it wasn't just anger at Sarah anymore. He was angry at the world that had allowed someone like her to slip through the cracks, and now his son was the one left to pick up the pieces. I need to know everything, Richard said, his voice cold and resolute. I need to know who she really is and what she's capable of. No more secrets. Carter nodded, a trace of sympathy in his eyes. We'll get to the bottom of this, Richard, but you need to be prepared. The truth might be darker than you ever imagined. As Richard left the precinct, his mind was spinning. The life he had known was shattered, and the consequences of Sarah's lies were far more than he had anticipated. As he stepped into the chilly night air, he knew that this investigation was just beginning, and it was about to lead him down a path that would change everything. The following week felt like an eternity for Richard Matthews. Every day was a blur of unanswered questions, investigations, and sleepless nights. He had come to realize just how little he truly knew about Sarah Winters, how much of her life was concealed behind a carefully crafted persona. He had expected that some of the pieces might be distorted or hidden, but he hadn't anticipated the depth of the deception, the true darkness lurking just beneath the surface. Detective Carter had been working tirelessly, digging deeper into Sarah's past, but each day revealed something more unsettling. Sarah's past wasn't just a web of lies. It was a tangled mess of manipulation, violence, and false identities, all designed to conceal her true self. As the investigation progressed, Richard could feel a sense of dread creeping over him. The calm, well-mannered woman who had charmed her way into his life and his son's heart seemed to have been nothing more than a carefully constructed mask, one that had slipped off far too easily. The woman who had claimed to love Alex was now a ghost, a stranger hiding behind a facade, and Richard feared what the truth would reveal. It wasn't until one chilly evening, as Richard sat in his study, staring blankly at the papers before him, that he received the call that would change everything. It was Detective Carter. Richard, Carter's voice crackled over the line, strained and heavy. You need to come down to the office. Now Richard's pulse quickened. He could tell by the tone of Carter's voice that this was not just another update. Something had happened. I'll be there in 15 minutes, Richard said, already rising from his chair. His mind raced, the possibilities rushing in like a flood. Was Sarah involved in something bigger than he had imagined? Had she left a trail of destruction in her wake that they were only now starting to uncover? 15 minutes later, Richard arrived at the precinct and was quickly ushered into Carter's office. The detective was standing by his desk, holding a manila folder in his hand. There were deep bags under his eyes and his face was pale. It was clear he hadn't been sleeping much. Either, sit down, Carter said, his voice tight. Richard took a seat, trying to steady his breath. What's going on, Tom? Carter opened the folder and slid it across the desk. I need you to look at this. It's the last piece of the puzzle. Richard opened the folder. Inside were photographs, grainy images taken from security cameras, and a report detailing the last known movements of Sarah Winters. She was in the city last week, Carter explained, watching Richard's reaction closely. And based on the timestamps, she was in a very specific location. Do you recognize this place? Richard looked at the photographs. The first image was of a street corner at night, bathed in the cold light of street lamps. The second image showed a door, the building number partially visible. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the address, 105 Sutter Street. That's a halfway house, Richard said quietly, staring at the address. But why would she be there? Carter nodded. That's the question I'm trying to answer. I pulled the records. Sarah, or Samuel, has been in and out of places like that for years. That's where things get complicated. Richard's eyes narrowed as he looked back at the detective. What are you talking about? Carter shifted in his seat. Before she transitioned, Samuel Winters was involved in the foster care system. He was in and out of different group homes and halfway houses for most of his childhood and early teens. No one really kept track of him. But the important thing is that while she was there were several violent incidents, fights, and there are records of her being transferred after certain altercations. Richard's stomach dropped. She's been violent for years. Carter leaned forward, his voice low. Yes, and there's something else. I've been tracking the addresses she's visited over the last few months. They all lead back to a network, in an underground network of people with a similar history. Foster care kids, runaways, and people with a history of violence and abuse. It's like she's been staying in contact with these people, drawing them into her life. Richard's mind was racing. Are you saying she's been involved in something criminal? We don't know yet, Carter said, frustration creeping into his voice. But I'm starting to think there's more to Sarah's story than just a bad past. There's a pattern of behavior, and that pattern involves violence. Richard's blood ran cold as he processed what Carter was saying. This wasn't just a woman who had hidden her past to protect herself. This was someone who had been involved in a dangerous world, a world where violence, deception, and manipulation were the currency. Carter continued, the last known place she stayed? A rundown hotel near the docks. I've got a few officers there now, checking out the area. But there's something else. According to some of the other records I've found, Samuel Winters was implicated in a few unsolved cases, mostly small-time thefts and assaults. But there's a bigger one in the mix, Richard. A woman went missing. A woman who was connected to the same group. Richard felt his pulse race. Missing? What happened to her? Carter paused for a long moment before answering. We don't know, but the woman was last seen with Samuel Winters. She had been seen arguing with him the day before she disappeared. Her name was Tara Williams, and she was in the system as well. She had a troubled past too, but she was well known in the community. Richard was already on his feet. What do you need me to do, Tom? I need you to stay calm, Carter said, his eyes meeting Richard's. We're going to get to the bottom of this, but it's going to take time. You can't make any rash decisions, not yet. Richard nodded, but the anxiety building in his chest wouldn't dissipate. His son's fiancée, the woman Alex had fallen in love with, was wrapped up in something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And now there was a missing woman whose last known connection had been to Sarah. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that Richard didn't want to acknowledge, but he couldn't ignore. Tell me everything you know, Richard said, his voice sharp now, and I'll do whatever it takes to help. But you need to promise me something, Tom. Carter raised an eyebrow. What's that? Promise me you'll bring her in, no matter what. We can't let this go any further. She's been lying to my family for too long. Carter hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. I promise. Richard's mind was spinning, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every step he took now seemed to be pulling him deeper into a nightmare. He had thought that discovering Sarah's past was the end of the road, but it was only the beginning. And as the investigation pressed forward, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness they were uncovering was much worse than anyone had ever suspected. Sit down, Carter said, his voice tight. Richard took a seat, trying to steady his breath. What's going on, Tom? Carter opened the folder and slid it across the desk. I need you to look at this. It's the last piece of the puzzle. Richard opened the folder. Inside were photographs, grainy images taken from security cameras, and a report detailing the last known movements of Sarah Winters. She was in the city last week, Carter explained, watching Richard's reaction closely. And based on the timestamps, she was in a very specific location. Do you recognize this place? Richard looked at the photographs. The first image was of a street corner at night, bathed in the cold light of street lamps. The second image showed a door, the building number partially visible. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the address, 105 Sutter Street. That's a halfway house, Richard said quietly, staring at the address. But why would she be there? Carter nodded. That's the question I'm trying to answer. I pulled the records. Sarah, or Samuel, has been in and out of places like that for years. That's where things get complicated. Richard's eyes narrowed as he looked back at the detective. What are you talking about? Carter shifted in his seat. Before she transitioned, Samuel Winters was involved in the foster care system. He was in and out of different group homes and halfway houses for most of his childhood and early teens. No one really kept track of him. But the important thing is that while she was there were several violent incidents, fights, and there are records of her being transferred after certain altercations. Richard's stomach dropped. She's been violent for years. Carter leaned forward, his voice low. Yes, and there's something else. I've been tracking the addresses she's visited over the last few months. They all lead back to a network, in an underground network of people with a similar history. Foster care kids, runaways, and people with a history of violence and abuse. It's like she's been staying in contact with these people, drawing them into her life. Richard's mind was racing. Are you saying she's been involved in something criminal? We don't know yet, Carter said, frustration creeping into his voice. But I'm starting to think there's more to Sarah's story than just a bad past. There's a pattern of behavior, and that pattern involves violence. Richard's blood ran cold as he processed what Carter was saying. This wasn't just a woman who had hidden her past to protect herself. This was someone who had been involved in a dangerous world, a world where violence, deception, and manipulation were the currency. Carter continued, the last known place she stayed? A rundown hotel near the docks. I've got a few officers there now, checking out the area. But there's something else. According to some of the other records I've found, Samuel Winters was implicated in a few unsolved cases, mostly small-time thefts and assaults. But there's a bigger one in the mix, Richard. A woman went missing. A woman who was connected to the same group. Richard felt his pulse race. Missing? What happened to her? Carter paused for a long moment before answering. We don't know, but the woman was last seen with Samuel Winters. She had been seen arguing with him the day before she disappeared. Her name was Tara Williams, and she was in the system as well. She had a troubled past too, but she was well known in the community. Richard was already on his feet. What do you need me to do, Tom? I need you to stay calm, Carter said, his eyes meeting Richard's. We're going to get to the bottom of this, but it's going to take time. You can't make any rash decisions, not yet. Richard nodded, but the anxiety building in his chest wouldn't dissipate. His son's fiancée, the woman Alex had fallen in love with, was wrapped up in something far darker than anyone could have imagined. And now there was a missing woman whose last known connection had been to Sarah. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that Richard didn't want to acknowledge, but he couldn't ignore. Tell me everything you know, Richard said, his voice sharp now, and I'll do whatever it takes to help. But you need to promise me something, Tom. Carter raised an eyebrow. What's that? Promise me you'll bring her in, no matter what. We can't let this go any further. She's been lying to my family for too long. Carter hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. I promise. Richard's mind was spinning, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Every step he took now seemed to be pulling him deeper into a nightmare. He had thought that discovering Sarah's past was the end of the road, but it was only the beginning. And as the investigation pressed forward, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness they were uncovering was much worse than anyone had ever suspected. Richard could feel the walls closing in. The truth was too much. Sarah, the woman he had thought he knew, was tied to a string of violent acts, lies, and now murder. And worse, it seemed like his own son, Alex, had been caught in the middle of it all. Are we sure about this? Richard asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Are we absolutely sure Sarah was involved? Carter met his gaze. I wish I could say we have definitive proof, but everything's pointing back to her. I need your help, Richard. We need to get Sarah in custody. We can't let her hurt anyone else. Richard stood there for a moment, staring at the photographs on the wall. He could feel the weight of his own failure bearing down on him. He had failed to protect his son from the woman who had once seemed like the perfect match. He had failed to see the darkness behind her charm. I'll help you, Richard said finally, his voice cold. Whatever it takes. They left the precinct and made their way to the warehouse where Sarah had been seen. As they neared the area, Richard could feel his heart pounding. They didn't know exactly where Sarah was, but they were certain she was hiding nearby. It was only a matter of time before she would slip up, and when she did, they would be ready. For Richard, this was no longer just an investigation. This was personal. His son's future, and perhaps his very life, had been tainted by the lies and violence of the woman he had once trusted. The hunt for Sarah was on, and Richard was determined to see it through, no matter where it led. He couldn't let her destroy any more lives, especially not his son's. The air was thick with tension as Richard Matthews stood at the edge of the dimly lit warehouse district. The buildings around him loomed like silent giants, casting long shadows in the flickering glow of the streetlights. The night had taken on an ominous quality, one that Richard couldn't shake. He had always believed that the truth could set things right, that once the lies were exposed, everything would be okay. But now, standing on the cusp of the most painful chapter of his life, he knew that the truth, no matter how hard it was to swallow, could destroy everything he had ever known. Detective Carter stood beside him, his gaze sharp and focused. He had been an unwavering ally throughout the investigation, but even he seemed on edge tonight. There was no more time for hesitation. They had traced Sarah Winters to this very place, and they knew that somewhere in these shadowed streets she was waiting, planning her next move. "She's here, Richard," Carter said quietly. "We have eyes on the area, but we don't know if she's alone or if she's armed." Richard nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. All he could think about was his son, Alex. His son who was too young to be caught up in something so dangerous, something so dark. Alex had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went, and Richard wasn't sure he could protect him from the fallout. But he had to try. For Alex's sake, for their family, he had to make sure Sarah couldn't hurt anyone else. As they moved toward the warehouse, the faint sound of sirens in the distance added to the weight of the moment. Richard's heart was pounding, but his resolve was clear. He had to face Sarah, had to understand how everything had spiraled out of control. He needed answers, not just for himself, but for Alex, who would never be the same after all of this. When they reached the building, Carter signaled for Richard to stay back. "We'll go in first. Stay here, and don't move unless I say so. This could get messy." Richard's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to standing back and waiting, not when everything was on the line. But he knew that Carter was right. There was no room for mistakes now. He watched as Carter and his team moved into position, quietly slipping through the cracks in the warehouse doors. Richard could barely make out the outline of their figures as they disappeared into the shadows. Time seemed to stretch into eternity. Every moment felt drawn out, like the seconds were slithering past him, thick and suffocating. Richard could feel his pulse in his throat, his breath shallow as he waited. Then a sudden noise, a crash, followed by a sharp cry, broke the silence. Richard's body jerked in response, his heart racing. "Move in!" Carter's voice barked from the darkness. Before Richard could take another breath, the door to the warehouse burst open, and the officers stormed inside. But as he rushed forward to follow them, the door slammed shut in his face. Panic surged through him. Was it too late? Had they already found her? Had Sarah escaped? Richard turned around, searching the night for any sign of what had happened. But before he could do anything, the warehouse door creaked open again, and Carter emerged, his face pale, his gun drawn. "She's here," Carter said, his voice low and strained. "But something's wrong, Richard. Something's really wrong." Richard's blood ran cold as he approached the door, his eyes scanning Carter's face. "What do you mean?" "We found her," Carter said, his words weighted with a mixture of disbelief and dread. "But she's not alone. Tara Williams. She's here too." The words barely registered in Richard's mind. His mind spun in confusion. Tara? The missing woman? "Wasn't she dead?" Carter continued, his voice shaky now. "Tara's alive. Or, at least she was when we found her. But there's something else. She's been tortured, Richard. She's been living here, chained up, for who knows how long." Richard took a step back, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. "Tara's alive? But we thought she was dead too," Carter said, his face grim. "But this is worse than we imagined. We found her barely conscious in a room in the back. And there's something we need to know. You need to hear it from her." Richard couldn't process the words. Everything had been flipped upside down. The investigation had taken yet another turn, and now the missing woman, Tara, wasn't just a victim, she was a piece of a puzzle that was more twisted than he had ever imagined. Carter motioned for Richard to follow him. They moved swiftly through the warehouse, passing by rusted machinery and crates that stacked like ghosts in the dark. Finally, they reached the back of the building, where a small, windowless room stood. Inside, Richard saw her. Tara Williams, barely recognizable, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. Carter stepped forward, crouching beside her. "Tara, can you hear me?" Tara's eyes flickered, and then she nodded slowly, her voice a hoarse whisper. She did this to me," Tara muttered, her voice weak but desperate. "I didn't know who she was. I didn't know what she was capable of." Richard's heart dropped as he stepped forward, kneeling beside the frail woman. "Tara, please, tell me everything. What happened?" Tara's breathing was labored, but she tried to focus on him. Samuel, told me she was trying to protect me. She said I was in danger, but it wasn't true. She just needed someone to take the fall for something. She was using me." Richard clenched his fists. "Using her?" She said she needed me to help her with something. She made me believe I had to protect her secret. She had control over me," Tara continued, her voice growing more strained. "I didn't know she was involved with all those people. I didn't know she was tied to all those murders. But she kept telling me she had to clean up the mess. She said I could never leave. And when I tried, she... Tara's words were cut off by a loud, horrifying sound, a voice from the shadows. Enough. Samuel Winters, stepped into the room, her face cold and expressionless. In that moment, Richard saw the true nature of the woman who had lied her way into their lives. The woman who had played him, played Alex, and destroyed everything she had touched. "You should have stayed away, Richard," Sarah said, her voice chilling. "You should have let it go." "Sarah," Richard said, his voice low but steady, "you're done. This ends now." Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly pulled a gun from behind her back and leveled it at Tara. "Don't think you have the power here, Richard. I didn't hurt her. Not directly. But I can make sure she never speaks again. I can make sure the whole world never knows what happened." Richard's heart hammered in his chest. The fear was suffocating, but something inside him snapped. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not to his son, and not to anyone else. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," Richard said, his voice hardening. He stepped forward, defiant, determined to protect those he loved. The room went silent as they stared each other down. And in that moment, it felt as if everything, the lies, the betrayal, the lives ruined, came crashing together. But before either of them could make another move, Carter's voice rang out from behind them. "Put the gun down, Sarah. It's over." The sound of sirens grew louder, and within seconds, the warehouse was swarming with officers. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering between Richard and the armed police officers who surrounded her. With a final angry glance, she dropped the gun, her shoulders sagging as she was taken into custody. As she was led away in cuffs, Richard felt a strange emptiness inside. The nightmare was over, but the damage was done. His son, his family, would never be the same. But at least now they had a chance to rebuild.